The rancher's boots hit the boardwalk just as the church bell struck 9, and the sound carried across Salvation Ridge like a warning no one wanted to hear. Thomas Garrett had ridden in from the northern pastures with dust on his shoulders and a week's worth of silence still clinging to his bones. He wasn't a man who came to town often, didn't need to, didn't want to, but the wire had snapped on the eastern fence line, and he needed supplies that couldn't wait. His horse stood tied to the post outside the general store, flicking flies with its tail, unbothered by the heat or the quiet that had settled over Main Street like a held breath. Thomas pushed open the door, and the bell above it rang thin and sharp. Inside, the store smelled of tobacco, leather, and something sour he couldn't name. Shelves lined the walls, stocked with tins and bolts of fabric and tools that hadn't sold in years. Behind the counter stood Samuel Pruitt, a man whose smile never reached his eyes and whose ledger always balanced to the penny. "Garrett," Pruitt said, nodding once. "Didn't expect you." "Wire," Thomas said. "And nails. Maybe a spool of cord if you've got it." Pruitt moved slow, pulling items from the shelves with the kind of deliberation that made every transaction feel like a negotiation. Thomas watched him, patient, his hands resting on the counter. He wasn't in a hurry. He never was. Then the door opened again. Thomas didn't turn at first. He heard the footsteps light, hesitant, and the soft rustle of fabric. It wasn't until Pruitt's face changed, his eyes narrowing with something between annoyance and satisfaction, that Thomas glanced over his shoulder. A young woman stood in the doorway, her hands clasped in front of her, her dress plain and patched at the hem. Her hair was tied back, dark and severe, and her skin was sun-touched in a way that spoke of long days outdoors. She looked tired, more than tired, worn down, like a stone that had been in the river too long. "Miss Clara," Pruitt said, and his voice had an edge now, sharp as a blade. "You know you're not supposed to be here." The woman, Clara, didn't move. Her eyes flicked to Thomas, then back to Pruitt. "I need flour," she said quietly, "and sugar, if you can spare it." "Can't spare what you can't pay for." "I'll pay next week. You know I'm good for it." Pruitt set the nails down on the counter with a heavy thud. "That's what you said last month. And the month before that." He leaned forward, his voice dropping lower, meaner. "You think I run a charity, girl? You think because your daddy—" "Samuel." Thomas's voice cut through the air like a door slamming shut. Pruitt stopped mid-sentence, his mouth still open. Clara's eyes widened, just slightly, and she took a half step back, as if bracing for something. Thomas turned fully now, his gaze steady on Pruitt. "She said she needs flour." Pruitt's jaw tightened. "With respect, Mr. Garrett, this ain't your concern." "Didn't say it was." Thomas reached into his coat and pulled out a folded bill, placing it on the counter with the kind of quiet finality that made arguing feel pointless. "Flour and sugar. Add it to my order." For a moment, no one moved. The air in the store felt thick, stifling, like the walls had shifted closer. Pruitt stared at the bill, then at Thomas, his face flushing red at the edges. "That's forbidden, sir," Clara said softly, and her voice trembled just enough to hear. "You don't—" Thomas looked at her then, really looked, and saw the fear in her eyes. Not fear of Pruitt, fear of something bigger, something that stretched beyond the walls of this store and into the bones of the town itself. "Maybe not," Thomas said, "but I know what I'm seeing." Pruitt exhaled through his nose, sharp and bitter. "You don't know a damn thing, Garrett." He snatched the bill off the counter and shoved it into the register. "Fine. Take your wire. Take her flour. But don't come back here thinking you're some kind of hero. This town's got rules, and they ain't written for men like you to break." Thomas didn't answer. He watched as Pruitt bagged the flour and sugar with rough, jerking movements, then slid them across the counter toward Clara. She took them carefully, her hands shaking just enough to notice. "Thank you," she whispered, though it wasn't clear who she was talking to. Thomas gathered his supplies and turned toward the door. Clara followed a few steps behind, her footsteps soft against the wooden floor. Outside, the sun was high and merciless, bleaching the dirt road white. Thomas tied his bag to the saddle and turned to find Clara standing a few feet away, clutching the flour against her chest like a shield. You shouldn't have done that, she said. Probably not. They'll talk. They always do. Thomas looked at her, at the exhaustion in her eyes, the way she held herself like someone expecting a blow, and felt something twist in his chest. He didn't know her, didn't know her story, but he recognized the look. He'd seen it before, in mirrors and in the faces of people who'd been told they didn't matter. Let them talk, he said. Clara's lips pressed together, and for a moment he thought she might cry, but she didn't. She just nodded, once, and turned to walk away. Thomas mounted his horse and rode out of town, the supplies rattling in the saddlebag. Behind him, Salvation Ridge watched in silence, and somewhere in the distance, a door creaked shut. He didn't know it yet, but what he'd done in that store would ripple outward, slow and unstoppable, like a stone dropped into still water, and by the time the truth came out, there would be no taking it back. Thomas didn't go home. He should have. The wire was still down, and the cattle had a way of wandering when the fences were weak, but instead, he found himself riding east, toward the edge of town where the houses thinned out and the land turned scrubby and wild. He told himself he was just checking the road, told himself it didn't matter, but he knew where Clara lived. Everyone did. The house sat alone at the end of a dirt path, small and weathered, with a sagging porch and windows that hadn't seen a proper cleaning in years. Smoke curled from the chimney, thin and gray, and a garden struggled in the front yard, rows of vegetables fighting against the dust and the heat. It looked like the kind of place people passed without looking, the kind of place that made you feel guilty just for noticing. Thomas stopped his horse at the edge of the property and sat there for a long moment, listening to the wind move through the grass. He didn't know what he was doing, didn't know why it mattered. Then the door opened, and Clara stepped out onto the porch. She froze when she saw him, her hand still on the doorframe. For a second, neither of them moved. Then she came down the steps, slow and cautious, the flower still tucked under her arm. "You followed me," she said. It wasn't an accusation, just a fact. "Wanted to make sure you got home safe." "I've been getting home safe my whole life," Thomas nodded. "I know." Clara studied him, her eyes searching his face for something she didn't seem to find. "Why'd you do it?" she asked quietly. "In the store. Why'd you pay for me?" Thomas looked past her, at the house, at the garden, at the way the land seemed to stretch out forever in every direction. "Didn't seem right," he said, "the way he talked to you. That's how everyone talks to me. Doesn't make it right." Clara's jaw tightened, and for the first time, he saw anger flicker across her face, sharp and quick, like a match struck in the dark. "You don't know what you did," she said. "You don't know what they'll do now." "Who's they?" She didn't answer. Instead, she turned and walked back toward the house, her shoulders stiff. Thomas dismounted and followed, his boots crunching against the dry earth. "Miss Clara, don't." She stopped at the porch steps, her back still to him. "Don't call me that. Don't pretend you care. Just go home, Mr. Garrett. Forget you saw me." "Can't do that." "Why not?" "Because I've already forgotten too many people," Thomas thought. "Because I know what it feels like to be invisible." But he didn't say any of that. Instead, he said, "Because it's not finished." Clara turned then, and her eyes were bright with something Thomas couldn't name. Fear, maybe, or hope, or both. "You think you can fix this?" she asked. "You think one act of charity changes anything?" "I think it's a start." She laughed, bitter and low. "You don't know this town. You don't know what they've already decided about me." "Then tell me." For a long moment, Clara just looked at him. Then slowly, she sat down on the porch steps, setting the flower beside her. Thomas waited, standing a few feet away, his hat in his hands. "My father," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper, "was accused of stealing cattle. 3 years ago, they said he worked with the Kiowa, that he sold information, that he was a traitor." She looked down at her hands. "They hanged him without a trial, right there in the town square." Thomas felt something cold settle in his chest. "He didn't do it," Clara continued. "But it didn't matter. Once they decided, that was it. And I've been paying for it ever since. Every store, every church, every person in this town, they look at me like I'm guilty too, like I carry his sins. That's not justice, Thomas said quietly. No, but it's what they call it. Thomas crouched down so he was level with her, his voice steady. You didn't do anything wrong. Neither did he. If what you're saying is true, and even if they've decided otherwise, that doesn't mean you have to live like this. Clara met his eyes, and he saw the weight she carried, years of it, heavy and unrelenting. You don't understand, she said. They won't let me leave, and they won't let me stay. I'm just here, waiting for them to decide what happens next. Thomas straightened, his jaw set. Then we change what happens next. How? He didn't have an answer. Not yet. But he knew one thing. Whatever came next, she wouldn't face it alone. Before he could say anything more, the sound of hoofbeats echoed from the road. Clara's face went pale, and she stood quickly, her hand gripping the porch railing. 3 riders appeared at the edge of the property, moving slow and deliberate. Thomas recognized one of them, Martin Cole, the deputy, a man with a badge and a grudge. The other 2 were ranchers, hard-faced and silent. Cole dismounted, his hand resting on the gun at his hip. Garrett, he said, his voice flat. Heard you made a scene in town today. Bought some supplies, Thomas said evenly. Didn't know that was against the law. It is when you're buying for her. Cole jerked his chin toward Clara. You know the rules. She's not welcome in town, and anyone who helps her, well, that makes you part of the problem. Thomas stepped forward, his body between Clara and the riders. There's no problem here, Martin. Just a man buying flour. Cole smiled, cold and humorless. See, that's where you're wrong. This town's got order, and order means consequences. The wind picked up, carrying dust across the yard. Thomas didn't move. Go home, Garrett, Cole said, before you make this worse. But Thomas didn't go home. He stood there, silent and immovable, and waited for whatever came next. The sun had dipped lower, casting long shadows across the yard when Martin Cole finally spoke again. You're making a mistake, he said, his voice carrying the weight of a threat wrapped in courtesy. Thomas didn't answer. He stood with his feet planted, his hands loose at his sides, watching the 3 men who sat on horseback like judges deliberating a sentence. Behind him, Clara's breathing was quick and shallow. He could feel her fear radiating outward, and it made something tighten in his chest. Not fear for himself, but fury at the casual cruelty of men who believed power gave them permission. This ain't your fight, one of the other ranchers said, a man named Duval with a scar across his cheek and eyes like cold iron. Girl's trouble. Always has been. You'd do well to walk away. Can't do that, Thomas said. Can't? Cole's smile widened. Or won't. Thomas met his gaze, steady and unflinching. Does it matter? Cole's smile faded. He swung down from his horse, his boots hitting the dirt with a heavy thud. He walked forward slowly, his hand never straying far from his holster. When he stopped, he was close enough that Thomas could see the lines around his mouth, the grayness in his stubble. You think you're some kind of hero, Garrett? Cole asked quietly. You think because you live out there on your own, you're above the rules we all follow? I think the rules you follow are meant to keep people down, not lift them up. Cole's jaw tightened. Careful. Words like that can get a man hurt. So can standing by while someone else gets hurt. For a moment, the 2 men just stared at each other, the air between them taut as a drawn bowstring. Then Cole stepped back, shaking his head slowly. All right, he said. You want to play hero? Fine. But when this blows back on you, don't say we didn't warn you. He turned toward his horse, and Thomas felt a flicker of relief, brief, fragile, before Cole stopped and looked back over his shoulder. One more thing, Cole said, his voice dropping lower. You keep helping her. People are going to start asking questions. Questions about you, about where you came from, about what you might be hiding. Thomas's blood went cold. Cole smiled, thin and knowing. Yeah, I thought that might get your attention. He mounted his horse, gathering the reins. Think about that, Garrett. Think real hard. The 3 riders turned and rode off. their horses kicking up dust that hung in the air long after they disappeared. Thomas stood there, his heart pounding, his hands clenched into fists. Behind him, Clara let out a shaky breath. "What did he mean?" she asked. "About you?" Thomas didn't answer. He couldn't. Not yet. Clara stepped around him, her eyes searching his face. "Thomas, it's nothing. It's not nothing." Her voice was sharper now, insistent. "He threatened you. What does he know?" Thomas looked at her, and for the first time since he'd ridden into Salvation Ridge 5 years ago, he felt the weight of the past pressing down on him, heavy and inescapable. "I wasn't always a rancher," he said quietly. Clara waited, her eyes wide. Thomas exhaled slowly. "I rode with a man once, a man who believed in things I didn't understand until it was too late. We did things I'm not proud of. And when it all fell apart, I walked away, changed my name, started over. Who were you?" "Someone I don't want to be again." Clara's face softened, just slightly. "And Cole knows?" "I don't know what he knows, but he's guessing. And if he starts digging—" Thomas trailed off, his voice tight. "Then we're both ruined." Clara finished. Thomas nodded. They stood there in the fading light, two people carrying pasts they couldn't escape, bound together by a single act of kindness that had set everything else in motion. "I should leave," Thomas said finally, "before I make this worse." "No." Clara's voice was firm, surprising even herself. "No, you shouldn't. Clara, if you leave now, they win. They decide who stays and who goes, who's guilty and who's innocent, and I'm tired of letting them decide." She stepped closer, her eyes fierce. "You stood up for me today. No one's done that in 3 years. So don't you dare walk away now." Thomas looked at her, this woman who'd been beaten down by a town that had already made up its mind about her, and he saw something he recognized, something stubborn and unbreakable, buried deep beneath the exhaustion. "All right," he said. "I won't leave." Clara nodded, her shoulders sagging with relief. "Thank you." They went inside as the darkness settled over the land, the stars beginning to prick through the sky. Clara lit a lamp, and the house filled with warm, flickering light. It was small, just one main room with a stove, a table, and a bed pushed into the corner, but it was clean, and it felt lived in a way Thomas's own house never had. Clara put water on to boil and set out 2 tin cups. Neither of them spoke for a long time. The silence wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of quiet that came from two people who'd said all they needed to say, at least for now. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the shutters. Thomas sat at the table, his hands wrapped around the warm cup Clara had given him, and listened to the house settle around them. "They'll come back," Clara said finally, her voice soft. "Cole and the others. They won't let this go." "I know. And when they do," Thomas looked at her, his expression unreadable, "then we'll be ready." Clara held his gaze for a moment, then nodded. She didn't ask what ready meant. She didn't need to, because whatever was coming, they would face it together. And that, Thomas realized, was something worth fighting for. The next morning came slow and quiet, the sun rising over the hills like it had all the time in the world. Thomas woke on the floor near the stove, his back stiff and his neck aching, but he didn't complain. Clara had offered him the bed, and he'd refused some lines, even now, felt important to hold. She was already awake when he stirred, standing at the stove with her hair tied back, frying eggs in a blackened skillet. The smell filled the small house, simple and good, and Thomas sat up, rubbing his face. "Didn't have to do that," he said. "You didn't have to stay," Clara replied without turning around. "Consider it even." They ate in silence, sitting across from each other at the small table. The eggs were overcooked and the coffee was weak, but Thomas didn't say anything. He just ate, grateful for the quiet and the company and the strange sense of normalcy that had settled over them. When they finished, Clara cleared the plates and set them in a basin by the door. She stood there for a moment, her hands resting on the edge of the basin, her back to him. "My father used to say that kindness was the hardest thing a man could choose," she said quietly, "because it costs you something every time." and most people don't have enough to spare. Thomas leaned back in his chair, listening. He was kind, Clara continued. Even when people turned on him, even when they accused him of things he didn't do, he stayed kind. He said it was the only way to stay human. She turned then, her eyes glistening. I didn't understand it. Not until he was gone. And by then it was too late to tell him. Thomas swallowed hard. He knew. How can you be sure? Because you're still here. Still fighting. That's how he knew. Clara's face crumpled, just for a second, and she looked away quickly, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. When she turned back, her expression was composed again, but Thomas could see the cracks beneath. What about you? She asked. What do you believe in? Thomas thought about that for a long time. He thought about the man he used to be, the things he'd done, the people he'd hurt. He thought about the years he'd spent alone, trying to bury the past under work and silence. I don't know, he said finally. I used to think I believed in loyalty, in following the men you rode with, no matter what. But that got people killed, got me almost killed. He paused, his voice quieter now. I guess I'm still trying to figure out what comes after that. Clara sat down across from him, her hands folded on the table. Maybe that's enough, she said. Just trying. They stayed like that for a while, the morning light streaming through the window, the world outside still and waiting. For the first time in years, Thomas didn't feel the need to be anywhere else. He didn't feel the weight of the past pressing down on him, didn't feel the urge to run. He just felt present. Tell me something, Clara said, breaking the silence. Something true. Thomas looked at her, surprised. Like what? Anything. Something you've never told anyone. Thomas hesitated, then leaned forward, his voice low. I had a brother, he said, younger than me. He followed me into that life I told you about, believed everything I believed, trusted everyone I trusted. He stopped, his jaw tight. He died because of it, because I was too stubborn to see what was happening until it was too late. Clara reached across the table and placed her hand over his. Her touch was warm, steady. That's why you stayed, she said. Yesterday. That's why you didn't walk away. Thomas nodded, unable to speak. You can't save him, Clara said gently. But you can save yourself. And maybe you can save me too. Thomas looked at her, at the strength in her eyes despite everything she'd been through, and felt something shift inside him, something he hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. I'll try, he said. Clara smiled, small and real, and for a moment the world outside didn't matter. The town, the deputy, the past, it all faded into the background, leaving just the two of them, sitting together in the light. Then a sound broke through the quiet. Hoofbeats. Multiple horses, moving fast. Clara's face went pale, and Thomas stood quickly, moving to the window. Through the glass, he saw them, at least a dozen riders, coming up the road toward the house. Cole was at the front, his face hard and determined. Behind him, the townspeople, ranchers, merchants, men Thomas recognized from Salvation Ridge. They're coming, Clara whispered. Thomas turned, his mind racing. Is there a back way out? Yes, but go now. I'm not leaving you. Clara. No. Her voice was firm, unyielding. If they're coming for me, I face them. And if they're coming for you, then we face them together. Thomas looked at her, saw the resolve in her eyes, and knew there was no point in arguing. She'd made her choice, and so had he. All right, he said. Then we do this together. They walked out onto the porch as the riders closed in, dust rising in their wake. Cole dismounted first, his hand on his gun, his expression cold. Time's up, Garrett, he said. This ends now. This ends now. Thomas stood at the edge of the porch, Clara beside him, and met Cole's gaze without flinching. Then let's end it, Thomas said. The wind picked up, carrying the dust and the tension and the weight of everything unsaid. And in that moment, standing side by side with someone who understood what it meant to be cast out, Thomas felt something he hadn't felt in years. He felt ready. Martin Cole stood in the center of the yard, the sun at his back, casting his shadow long across the dirt. Behind him, the riders formed a loose semicircle, their faces set, their eyes hard. Thomas counted 13 men, more than he'd expected, more than he could fight, but he wasn't here to fight, not unless he had to. You had your chance to walk away, Cole said, his voice carrying across the yard, but you chose this, so now we do it the hard way. What exactly are you doing, Martin? Thomas asked, his voice calm but firm. You bring a mob to a woman's house because she bought flour? A few of the men shifted uncomfortably, their eyes darting to one another. Thomas saw the doubt creeping and the realization that maybe they'd been swept up in something they didn't fully understand. This ain't about flour, Cole snapped. This is about order, about rules, and about people knowing their place. Her place, Thomas gestured to Clara. Her father was hanged without a trial. She's been shunned for 3 years for crimes she didn't commit. What place do you think she should know? Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Cole's jaw tightened. Her father was a traitor, Cole said. Was he? Thomas stepped forward, off the porch, his boots hitting the dirt. Or was he just convenient? Easy to blame, because from where I'm standing it looks like this town needed a villain, and you gave them one. You don't know what you're talking about. Cole growled. Then prove me wrong. Thomas spread his hands. Show me the evidence. Show me the trial records, the witnesses, the proof that Jacob Hart did what you said he did. Cole said nothing. Thomas looked past him, at the men gathered behind him, ranchers he'd traded with, merchants he'd bought from, men who'd nodded to him on the street. Any of you ever see proof? He asked. Any of you ever ask for it? Silence. One of the men at the back, a rancher named Hayes, shifted in his saddle. Cole said the territorial marshal confirmed it. He said, his voice uncertain, said Hart was working with the Kiowa. And did any of you see that confirmation? Thomas pressed. Did anyone read it? Or did you just take his word? Hayes looked at Cole, then back at Thomas. I assumed. Assumptions get innocent people killed, Thomas said. His voice was steady, but there was steel beneath it now. And guilt by association keeps them dead long after they're gone. Cole's face flushed red. You're out of line, Garrett. Am I? Thomas took another step forward. Because it seems to me like you're the one who's afraid. Afraid that if people start asking questions, they might not like the answers. Cole's hand dropped to his gun. Don't. Clara's voice rang out, clear and strong. She stepped down from the porch, moving to stand beside Thomas. Don't make this worse than it already is. Cole stared at her, his eyes narrowing. You should have left when you had the chance. I'm not leaving, Clara said. This is my home, my father's home, and you don't get to take it from me just because you're scared of the truth. Truth? Cole laughed, bitter and sharp. You want the truth? Fine. Your father was guilty. Maybe not of selling to the Kiowa, but guilty of something. Everyone in this town knew it. And if we hadn't done something, if we hadn't made an example of what? Thomas interrupted. Fear, control, how to turn on your neighbors when it's convenient. Cole's face twisted. You don't understand. This town was falling apart. We needed order. You needed a scapegoat, Thomas said, and you picked a man who couldn't fight back. The crowd had gone silent now, the weight of Thomas's words settling over them like a shroud. Hayes dismounted slowly, his face troubled. Martin, he said quietly, is that true? Did we hang an innocent man? Cole whirled on him. Don't you turn on me now. I'm not turning on you, Hayes said. I'm asking a question. One by one, the other men began to dismount, their expressions shifting from certainty to doubt. Duval, the scarred rancher, crossed his arms and stared hard at Cole. I got a bad feeling about this, Martin. Real bad. Cole looked around, his face flushing darker, his hand still hovering near his gun. You're all fools. He spat. You think she's innocent? You think he's some kind of saint? He's got a past, too. I've heard the stories. Then tell them, Thomas said, his voice cutting through the air. Tell them who I used to be. Tell them what I did. And then let them decide if it changes anything. Cole hesitated, his mouth opening and closing like a fish on dry land. I rode with bad men, Thomas said, turning to face the crowd. I did things I'm not proud of, and when it all fell apart, I ran, changed my name, started over. I'm not perfect. Hell, I'm not even close. But I know the difference between justice and revenge, and what you did to Jacob Hart wasn't justice. The wind moved through the yard, stirring the dust. No one spoke. Finally, Hayes stepped forward. I think we made a mistake, he said quietly. I think we let fear make us do something we shouldn't have. And if that's true, he looked at Clara, his face lined with shame. Then I'm sorry, Miss Hart. For what it's worth, I'm sorry. One by one, the other men nodded, their eyes dropping, their shoulders sagging. Even Duval looked uncomfortable, his jaw tight. Cole stood alone now, his hand still on his gun, his eyes wild. You're all cowards, he hissed. Every last one of you. No, Thomas said. They're just people trying to do the right thing. Even if it's late. Cole stared at him, hatred burning in his eyes. For a moment, Thomas thought he might draw, thought this might end the only way these things ever seemed to end in the West, with blood and regret. But then Cole let his hand drop. He turned, mounted his horse, and rode off without another word, his shadow shrinking into the distance. The men stayed a little longer, offering quiet apologies, promises to make things right. Hayes shook Thomas's hand and nodded to Clara, his face heavy with guilt. When they finally left, the yard was empty again, the dust settling back into place. Thomas and Clara stood side by side, watching the last rider disappear over the hill. Do you think it'll change anything? Clara asked. Thomas thought about that. Maybe, he said. Maybe not, but it's a start. Clara looked at him, her eyes soft. Thank you, she said, for staying. Thank you, Thomas said, for reminding me why it matters. They stood there a while longer, the sun warm on their faces, the wind carrying the scent of grass and earth, and for the first time in 3 years, Clara felt like she could breathe. Years later, when travelers passed through Salvation Ridge, they'd sometimes hear the story of the rancher and the woman who'd stood against the town. Some said Thomas Garrett stayed on his ranch and lived out his days in quiet solitude. Others said he and Clara Hart built a life together, their land stretching wide and their roots running deep. The truth, like most truths in the West, was somewhere in between. What mattered was this. On a hot day in late summer, a man had chosen kindness over silence. A woman had chosen courage over fear, and a town had been forced to look at itself in the mirror and reckon with what it saw. Not everyone liked what they found, but some did, and that was enough. The barn still stood at the edge of Clara's property, weathered and worn, a reminder of the day everything changed. And sometimes, when the wind was right, you could almost hear the echo of hoofbeats fading into memory, a sound that meant both an ending and a beginning. The West was hard. It always had been. But it was also full of people trying, in their own broken way, to be better than they were yesterday. And that, in the end, was the only story worth telling.